So let's start by welcoming Susan, Dr. Susan Benson, and saying thank you very much, Susan, for joining us. So just a brief introduction about Susan. Susan is a psychiatrist and family therapist, and she has served as chair of the Faculty of the Psychiatry of Old Age, and has held numerous posts, including NHS consultant posts in Manchester and Wolverhampton. And Susan is currently visiting professor of mental health and ageing at the University of Chester. Obviously, she's done many more things, but she will talk to you about that, and you can see her profile on the conference programme. So I'm going to hand over to Susan now to start her presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I gave it what I thought of the sexy title, hopefully to get people interested. So this is part of my collection of cuttings that involve domestic homicides and older people. So you can see them on the screen, and I've added the links on the screen. I think one of the interesting things bottom left is that the National Crime Survey has traditionally had an upper age cutoff and has only just started recording data on domestic abuse for those aged 75 plus. So there's a bit of ageism built into some of the figures that come out through the National Crime Survey. So I thought that was an interesting thing to draw to your attention. And I'd like you to think about what are the messages that you pick up about domestic violence and domestic homicide and older people. Are there myths? Are there stereotypes? Are there prejudices? What sorts of messages have you picked up? Because, of course, some of them will have come from the media, like the cuttings that I showed you a few minutes ago. So we'll give you about 8 to 10 minutes in the breakout room. And then when you come back, I'd like you just to type a few brief comments to indicate the sort of things you've identified in the conversation so that I can get a feel for the things that you've identified. I can tell you some of the things that were talked about in the group I was in. They talked about the idea of men being perpetrators rather than women. Also that some people don't really believe it happens when we're talking about older people. Men who kill their wives being seen as compassionate, rather than and not being punished in the same sort of way, so being seen differently. So I guess which is the connection with issues to do with carers and things. Has anybody put anything into the chat that we can add to that?
Not yet.
Okay. So if there are other ideas, it would be great if you could put them into the chat so we can get a feel for the sort of ideas that came up. Older people won't be believed if they report domestic abuse, and being explained away as a stressed carer. Those are two other ideas that people have put into the chat. Absolutely. I think those are both very pertinent and very relevant. So I want to say something first of all about terminology. I think one or two people have used the term intimate partner violence, and then at the worst, at the extreme of that, intimate partner homicide. There's also adult family violence, which is where where the person who perpetrates the homicide is a member of the family but not an intimate partner, and that would be called adult family homicide if it resulted in a murder. And then there are various different terms, which I've listed some of them there. Fratricide, which is, I think, killing your brother; matricide, your mother; patricide, your father; and parricide is used as a more generic term to cover the murder of a parent, close relative, or primary caregiver. So there are all those different terms, and it can get very difficult to make sure that we know what we're talking about. And it's also complicated by the fact that people may use the term elder abuse. So where an older adult has been involved, it may be seen as elder abuse rather than being seen within the spectrum of domestic abuse. There is some literature about the differences with regard to older women and domestic abuse, and I've put some of those on this next slide. That maybe there's an increased likelihood of depression, anxiety, there's suicide risk. There can be a negative impact on the person's memory and concentration, which of course can be a sort of an interface with the question of whether people have got dementia or a degree of cognitive impairment. Substance misuse still associated with it in older women, may be seen as vulnerable, less able to defend themselves. There is evidence that they're more likely to live with their abusers, and maybe it's even more stigmatizing and embarrassing if you've been in a relationship for many years to start to disclose that it's been an abusive relationship. And we touched on attitudes and beliefs. This is taken from a Home Office document that I put on the bottom. I have put the references onto a final slide, which I won't show you, but if you get a copy of the slides, that'll be included, showing really that the peak, if you like, of intimate partner homicides is between the ages of 30 and 50, but there is a tail going into later life. And the interesting thing for me about this is intimate partner homicides. They excluded from the figures that they presented adult family homicides, so homicides committed by a member of the family who's not an intimate partner. And I think that's actually quite important, and I'll come on to that in a few minutes. So I'm involved in doing domestic homicide reviews as an independent chair, and I did a research project with some of my colleagues where we got hold of the reviews and we analysed them. But domestic homicide reviews are done under the Domestic Violence Crime and Victims Act, which I've put on there, which came into force in 2011. And I've put there the criteria for a domestic homicide, which are the bullet points 3 onwards. So it's a review of the circumstances in which somebody aged 16 or over has died, and that death appears to have resulted from violence, abuse or neglect, either by somebody with whom they're in an intimate personal relationship or by a member of the same household. So actually within domestic homicides, it includes intimate partner homicide, but it also includes what might be called adult family homicides by other members of the family. And actually I did one where it was a person who was staying with that adult temporarily, having come out of prison, but yet they were seen as being a member of the same household, and that meant that it qualified as a domestic homicide. I'm not going to go into the domestic homicide review process, which is why I've left that slide blank, because I think that would be too long. But the main point about it is that it's about learning. It's about looking at what agencies were involved or might have been involved, and what we can learn from their involvement or non-involvement that might improve things for people subject to domestic violence and abuse in the future. So I'm going to go on and tell you a bit about the study that we were involved with. I don't know whether anybody here has used freedom of information requests. They're of course quite an interesting facility to have available, because you can ask for information from public bodies. It does get rather complicated and quite long-winded, and I had a very big spreadsheet to try and keep track of all the contacts I had with public bodies. We contacted 240 agencies. And what we asked them was, we asked them for some basic information about domestic homicides that had happened, and for copies of the reports. We were asking for homicides where either the victim or the perpetrator or both were aged 60 and over, and those agencies reported to us 62 domestic homicides in the period that we asked them about, which I think was 2011 to 2015. And of those 62 domestic homicides, we were able to get hold of 30 of the reports. And as you can see there, in 17, the victim was over 60, in 6, the perpetrator was, and in 7, both victim and perpetrator were over 60. So this is just taking a bit of an overview of the 30 reports that we got hold of. You can see there that the majority of victims, but not all of them, were women. 24 victims were women. The majority of perpetrators were men, 29 out of the 30 were men, and the one domestic homicide where a woman was involved, she was actually assisted by a man, so it wasn't her on her own. You can see the age range of the victims and the age range of the perpetrators, because of course perpetrators may have been involved in a homicide where they killed someone younger. Victims may have been involved in a homicide where they were killed by somebody older, and there was a small subgroup where the victim or the perpetrator, I've used V for victim and P for perpetrator, was from a minority ethnic group, which you can see on there. And there was one case in our 30 DHRs where it was a gay relationship. So we collected these review reports, we put them into software that you can use to assist with a qualitative analysis, and we carried out a thematic analysis on them. And I'm going to just go through quite briefly some of the overarching themes. So this is my diagram of the overarching themes. So I've got the context, which is the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim, and then there were 4 headline themes. I'm just going to start from anywhere. So mental illness in the perpetrator, history of domestic abuse, either in the relationship where the homicide occurred or in another relationship, financial exploitation, stealing, worries about finances, financial issues in the broader sense, and then drug and alcohol abuse in the perpetrator. Thinking about the relationship, sometimes there was an issue about the breakdown of the relationship. Sometimes there was an issue about caregiving with the relationship. So I think those are 2 points to bear in mind. There is some literature that talks about domestic abuse grown old, but I think only one of the reports that we saw would have fitted into that category, where people had been together over a number of years, a couple had been together over a number of years, and there was established domestic abuse, and then eventually it culminated in a domestic homicide. I'm going to go through the other 4 themes briefly now. It was interesting looking at the relationships because they varied on a spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, there was what were described as close and loving relationships, positive, supportive relationships. So this might be the sort of relationship that someone talked about in the chat, where a supposedly loving husband actually kills their wife for whatever reason. I do apologise to the men for picking a husband who killed a wife, but it is more likely to be a man who is the perpetrator, and that's why I did that. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have relationships that are known to be fraught, tense, love-hate relationships, very volatile, chaotic and turbulent relationships. So it's not that it's always what is known to be a difficult relationship. It may actually be a relationship that everyone around this couple or family believes to be close and loving. So I've given some examples as I go through to give you a bit of a feel for it. So relationship breakdown, we've got one there where a woman who had become estranged from her former husband started a new relationship, filed for divorce, and then the domestic homicide occurred. The one at the bottom left is also quite interesting, because this was a woman who had left her husband and they'd been talking about divorce. He then became admitted to a mental health ward with depression, and when he was discharged, she went home to look after him. I think he was actually on leave, if I remember rightly. And when he didn't return and couldn't be contacted, it was found that she'd been murdered and he had committed suicide. So that was what we would describe as a homicide suicide. And I've got some slides on that a bit later on. And in relation to caregiving in the relationship, so there are two examples here. So there was a man who was seen as a devoted carer who was looking after his wife really well and was seen as managing any risk related to her illness, and wasn't thought for a minute to pose a risk to her. But then this ended in domestic homicide too. The second example on the right there is a wife who was looking after her husband with dementia. He was at times aggressive and resistive in relation to care. She was subjected to a series of assaults and eventually incurred a head injury and subsequently died. So that was also a domestic homicide. So we've got a mix of all sorts of different relationships. So one of the things that I said was a major theme was mental illness of the perpetrator, and I've given an example on here, which was a son who killed his mother, and he was psychotic, and he told people after he was arrested that he'd killed the she-devil, that she'd shape changed into a demon. And this was a son who was known to have a psychotic illness, and unfortunately this is what happened. So he was quite clearly very mentally ill. Drug and alcohol or alcohol abuse. So two examples here. Perhaps I should have said the codes for the reviews. Where it's V, it's the victim who was over 60. Where it's a P code, the perpetrator was over 60. And where it's a B code, both victim and perpetrator were over 60. Don't know whether that helps. So the bullet point at the top was a victim who was over 60. So she was older, chronically unwell, living with an adult son who had a history of alcohol and drug abuse and had possibly had psychosis in the past. And the son killed the mother. And the one at the bottom was a P, so the perpetrator was over 60. So this was a victim with an alcohol abuse problem, as well as depression and family bereavements, and the perpetrator also had an alcohol abuse problem. So there was actually alcohol abuse in both the victim and the perpetrator of that second example. Financial issues. So the example I've got here was a victim over 60. So this was a son who killed his mother, and he had been in the habit of getting money off his mother and sometimes his stepfather to spend on drugs and alcohol. And he had a history of having been physically assaultative towards his mum. And in fact, the report said that there was abuse in relation to all those different areas that you can see listed there on the slide: financial, physical, emotional, psychological. History of domestic abuse in this relationship or other family relationships. So I've got two separate ones there, both of which where the victim was over the age of 60. So the top one was a son who killed his father, and he'd grown up in a family where both his parents drank heavily and there were frequent episodes of domestic violence. He himself, the son, was subjected to abuse within the family and also neglect. And the second example there, again, a son who killed his father. The son knew that his mother was subjected to domestic abuse by his father, but the son also had been accused of domestic violence related offences against a number of previous partners. And it was said in the report that he had a tendency to resolve domestic issues by using violence towards partners. So some of these families were families where there was clearly a lot of abuse in the family context, sometimes going back for many years. So I've gone through all of those. I'm wondering whether there are any comments in the chat that Catherine would like to bring in. I've noticed there've been quite a lot of comments.
Yes, there's been lots of comments and questions as you've gone through, Susan. So comments are relating to women having feelings of being disbelieved and fear of stigma, fear of change, concerns when your abuser is also your carer.
Yeah.
The comment that older people are often infantilized. Comments that abuse affects all communities and backgrounds, both rich and poor.
Yeah.
And then there's two questions. I don't know if you want to take the questions.
Do you think it's appropriate to take them? Well, tell me what they are, and then if they would be better.
Yeah. So one is, when did the National Crime Survey start including statistics for the over 75s? And the second is
just about to start. I think that has only just been agreed late last year. So right up until recently, it wasn't including over 75s. Yeah.
So that's good. That's a good recent development.
Yeah.
And the second question was, how often do you think are what's defined as close and loving relationships actually coercive?
Oh, I mean, that is such a good question. As part of the domestic homicide review procedure, you are expected. There are guidelines on the Home Office website, which if anybody's interested in, they can look those up. But you're expected to talk to relatives, friends, employers, anybody who can be accessed in order to get a broader picture of the relationships involved. Of course, sometimes people refuse to be involved. Sometimes they agree to be involved. It can be very variable. And sometimes the person who's perpetrated the domestic homicide may actually agree to be involved, but then you'd need to bear in mind the position that they're coming from. So we try to get a picture of the relationship that is as broad as we possibly can, but whether we always get access to that information, your guess is as good as mine, because I'm sure that must be the case sometimes, that the outward picture is that the relationship is close and loving, but actually behind closed doors it may be different. So I think those are really good points that people have brought up. Shall I move on with a few more slides, and perhaps Kathleen would keep an eye on the chat for me? Thank you. Right, so now I've briefly divided them up into, I said the B code was people where both were aged 60 and over. So there were 7 domestic homicide reviews where both victim and perpetrator were over the age of 60. And in those cases, all the victims were women and all the perpetrators were men. All the relationships were intimate partner relationships. And you can see there, 4th bullet point down, that many relationships had gone on for decades. And it must be really difficult if you're in an abusive relationship and you've been in it for decades to even think about change, which I think was a point somebody else made. 3 out of these 7 domestic homicides were murder-suicides. And the predominant factor, I said there were 4 factors, and there were 4 factors, but the main factor in these was major mental illness in the perpetrator. Alcohol wasn't particularly a feature. The homicides took place in the person's own home, and there were 3 that involved dementia. In one, a depressed carer killed his wife, who had a diagnosis of dementia and who he was the carer for, and in 2, a person with dementia was killed by their carer. So I think the issue of dementia is an interesting one, and we might want to come on to that later. Here's a quote from one of the domestic homicides. This was a man who killed his wife, and the information from the family was that they'd become concerned that he might harm himself or harm his wife. And he'd been referred to treatment by the local mental health team. But as you can see in the 2nd bullet point, they'd felt pressurized into accepting home treatment. This was a man who had a history of very severe depressive illness, and he'd actually had ECT treatment, which is only used for very severe depressive illness these days. But the family felt that he'd been pressurized into accepting home treatment rather than being taken into hospital and given the treatment which they knew from experience, that's the quote there, had worked. And the family certainly believed that if their father had been admitted to hospital when he first approached services for help, and treated in hospital, he would have got better, as he had on 7 previous occasions, and their mother would never have been murdered. So this was a very distressing, I mean, they're all very distressing, but the distressing thing for the family was that they felt this was entirely preventable, I think, if he'd had the treatment they felt he needed. So I've now got a couple of slides to do with the domestic homicides where it was the perpetrator was aged 60 plus. Again, in this group, all the victims were women, all the perpetrators were men, and all the relationships were intimate partner relationships. Again, they were often relationships that had lasted for a number of decades, and there were 2 out of the 6 that were murder-suicides combined. In these cases, the murder took place either in the victim's home or the perpetrator's home. And it was interesting that 3 out of the 6 were involved strangulation. Alcohol was a feature. One of them was what I referred to previously as domestic abuse grown old. So there was a long history of domestic abuse, but it had eventually culminated in a domestic homicide. And there were lots of mental health issues in the victims and in the perpetrators. So we've got an example here from it. I think this is the example of the domestic homicide grown old. So one of the adult children of the couple said that he first became aware of the domestic abuse of his mother when he was 9 or 10. And that's what's described in the first bullet point. So he would be aware of arguments, he would be aware of his mother later having bruises. And went on to say that there were periods when his parents separated, but whatever happened, they always got back together again. And ultimately, his father killed his mother. So that's domestic abuse grown old. The next group, I think this is a very interesting group because this is the group where the victim is aged over 60. There were no murder-suicides in this group, and 14 out of the 17 could be described as adult family homicides. So that's 14 where the person who perpetrated the homicide was a member of the family, but not an intimate partner of the person who was murdered. So that, in terms of our total of 30 domestic homicides that we looked at, that's almost 50%. Fell into the category of adult family homicide. And you can see that in 12 of the 14 cases, it was a parent who was killed. 9 cases of those 12 was the mother and 3 it was the father. 2 were grandparents. So that's the 14 who were adult family homicides. And then there were 2 in this group where the victim was aged over 60, but remember the perpetrator was aged under 60, which was committed by a spouse or partner. One was a gay couple and one was an ex-partner. So I think this is a really interesting group because I think I referred earlier to that publication from the Home Office where they said that they analysed the intimate partner homicides, but they didn't look at adult family homicides because they were a small group. Now, they may be a small group, but it looks as though they disproportionately involve older adults, which is why I think that they're important. Major mental illness in 7 perpetrators who were involved in this group. Complex family relationships complicated by drug or alcohol abuse, and a number of others as well. So this is one of the adult family homicides where it was a son who had an established psychotic illness and was under the care of mental health teams locally, and he killed his mother. And the interesting thing about this one, and to an extent this generalized to some of the others, was that she wasn't involved in his care. She was kept out. So I think one of the interesting things is that if you're an adult, you're an adult. And if you decide that your mum or your dad, who might be living with you, might be supporting you, maybe even caring for you, you can decide that they're not going to be involved in conversations. They're not going to be present at care planning meetings or whatever. So she wasn't engaged with in any way. And that was seen as an omission on the part of the mental health team. And the son quite clearly didn't want his mum to be involved, didn't have his mum to have a carer's assessment. She wasn't approached because he was seen as being the client, the customer, I don't know what term you want to use, and his decision was that she wasn't involved. So that I thought was quite an interesting sort of illustration of the issue about maybe confidentiality, maybe about relationships, maybe about how mental health services involve family when the person that they're looking after and treating is seen as being an adult who's responsible for themselves. And then this is an example of what I've described as complex family relationships. I wasn't quite sure how to describe it, but this was a young man who'd grown up in a family where his parents drank heavily, where there was quite a chaotic lifestyle, lots of episodes of domestic violence. He was abused, he was neglected, and eventually he went on to kill his son. But it sounded as though things had been going wrong over a long period of time, and this was how it eventually ended. So I've got some stuff about murder-suicides. I didn't know whether you might be interested in that. But what it says in the literature is that the perpetrators are almost exclusively men. The victims are almost exclusively women. Perpetrators are older than the average homicide offender, and tends to be a larger age gap than is usual in intimate partner relationships, and that studies that have been done on larger groups of murder-suicide found emotional disturbance in all the perpetrators. But interestingly, it wasn't always the case that there was a history of domestic abuse in the relationship. We had 5 murder-suicides in our group, 3 where both partners were aged 60 plus, and 2 where it was the perpetrator who was aged 60 plus. I want to pause there and see if there are any comments or anything anybody would like to feedback from the chat. Kathleen, is there anything you'd like to feedback for us?
We've got some general comments about the prevalence of mental illness, and wondering about whether mental health services are equipped to recognise or deal with this, which I think you've addressed throughout your presentation. And then there are 4 questions.
Okay, so do you want to do the questions, and then I'll go on to what I've called take-home messages, which address, I think, link with some of the comments that we've had as well.
Great. Okay, so first question is, do you feel that mental illness can be used as an excuse by perpetrators?
Oh, I think that's a really interesting question. I think in the reviews that I read and studied and analysed, I think that it was usually very severe mental illness. I don't think it was used as an excuse. I think these were people who really genuinely were extremely ill, rather than it being used as an excuse. I think there was one interesting case included. Not quite sure whether I put it on the take-home messages or not. I might have taken it out, where the husband who'd killed his wife tried to make out that she had dementia. So he tried to, sorry, that sounds quite prejudicial, doesn't it? But he said that she had dementia and that he was her carer, and that so that it wasn't that he'd killed her, that I don't think her body was found actually, that she'd wandered off because of her dementia and died as a result of that. And there was no evidence whatsoever that she had dementia or that she had any cognitive difficulties at all. So it was thought in that case, I think he was found to be responsible, and he was convicted of murder. But but it was thought that he was trying to use that as a way of escaping full responsibility for what had happened. So I guess that links with the question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are cases where that happened. And the other case that I remember, I don't know whether I can remember all the details, but I did say there was one case where there was a gay relationship, and this one was really interesting and also I think quite heartbreaking, really, because it was a man whose partner had died and then started a new relationship with a younger man. And he told his family and his friends that they were going to get married and that they were partners, and that, you know, he loved his new partner, and it was all there we are, that was the way it was going. But there were suggestions that he was falling and being injured, which was thought to be down to his age. So he presented occasionally with injuries. I think he had some physical health problems, so it was accepted that maybe it was down to his physical health. Eventually, he went into A&E, and after something had happened, I forget the details, and he disclosed 3 times in A&E that he was being abused by his partner. His partner told the staff that he was the carer and that these things had happened accidentally, and they believed the carer and not the older partner, who was eventually murdered. And the report of the homicide, I think the post-mortem found 23 fractures. He'd obviously been abused over a long period of time, and despite the fact that he'd disclosed he was abused, hadn't been taken seriously, and no action had resulted from that. And again, that was one of the ones where there were a few cases where you felt that actually, you know, there were possibilities to change the course of events, and that was another one where it really felt as though it could have ended differently if people had heard what he'd said. And I think that links in with the comments people have made about older people not necessarily being believed, members of the family claiming to be carers when maybe they are carers, maybe they're not carers, and something about the difficulty of understanding the caring relationship between partners as well. Did you have another question?
Thank you. There's lots more, but I'll try and focus on the key ones. Could you share a little bit about what research has been done about this subject?
What research has been done? Well, I mean, we published our paper, and I think I've put the reference onto the list of references at the end. And it's interesting that about the same time that we were doing our study, someone called Hannah Bowes, BOWS, was also putting in freedom of information requests, and she did a slightly different but related study. She was interested in looking at more a statistical overview, whereas we were doing a more detailed thematic analysis of the reports. But I'm pretty sure that I've put that one into the reference list as well. Lovely. So hopefully people will get those.
Thank you. And then there's a question about were the cases that you've referred to known to social services?
Oh, it varies whether they were known to social services or they weren't. I mean, that's in the detail of the reports. I think it's quite difficult for people sometimes to be open and to disclose, particularly in these very long established relationships, and B, somebody, I think maybe in the group I was in at the start, talked about and I can't remember quite how they put it, but it was something about the difficulty of accepting caring and being of a generation that's used to being independent and not necessarily accepting that you want outside care coming in. Is there another quick question, Kathleen? And then maybe I can...
quick one, interesting international one from Australia, from one of our participants in Australia, where mercy killings are regarded as legal. And how would you classify or feel about mercy killings?
Well, I think that's a very interesting point, isn't it? And I think that links in with the comment that somebody made about men sometimes, well, their comment was that men being seen as compassionate and caring, and that's why they killed their wives. But you know, there are services available. You don't have to carry on looking after your partner. I'm sure you could produce another argument in a different direction. But I guess if you've been together for decades, how hard is it to imagine, you know, going separate ways? How hard is it? It's often hard, isn't it, for people that we meet where one partner goes into care and they find it so hard to accept that one partner's gone into care. So you can see how ideas might get distorted and people might feel that it's a caring thing to do. I have to say it doesn't feel particularly caring to me. So, yeah. Sorry, that's not a very good answer, is it? So I think the terminology is confusing. Beware the terminology. I think where people see something as being elder abuse rather than seeing it as being domestic abuse, maybe that kind of softens it in some sort of way. Maybe age is a factor that increases the risks to victims, because if we're frailer, if we're less physically robust, maybe we're more likely to come to harm, whereas a younger, fitter, stronger person might not come to harm. I think we need to increase awareness that domestic violence occurs across the whole of the age spectrum. I think somebody referred to something that for me connected with risk assessments, and I do worry that in older adult services, and I've worked in older adult services for many years, when we do risk assessments, we're thinking about things like, you know, are they eating properly? Are they taking their medicine? Are they at risk of falling? All those sorts of older adult type risks, rather than thinking about the sorts of risks that we might think about in younger adults, which might be related to interpersonal violence. So I wonder if sometimes the risk assessments used in older adult services are orientated differently and wouldn't necessarily pick up things to do with domestic abuse. We talked about myths and older people, didn't we, at the beginning? So I probably don't need to say very much about that. If I can just say that people have expressed to me myths about dementia, saying that people with dementia are predisposed to violence, and if the number of people in the community with dementia goes up, then we can expect more domestic violence. But actually the violence that takes place when people have dementia is often disorganized and not focused in the way that the sort of violence that in most cases is involved in these domestic homicides is. But at the same time, it's not true that frail older adults are not physically capable of extreme violence. I had involvement in a domestic homicide where an elderly man killed his wife, and he was known to have a knife that he kept handy. But because he wasn't very mobile, because he didn't move very fast, he wasn't seen as being a risk. Now, if he'd been a young, fit man, they'd have seen him as being a risk. So I think sometimes these myths can be quite powerful and can affect how services deal with people. I think caring is stressful for the carer, but it's stressful for the person being cared for too. So there's something about the balance of power in caring and dependency for me, and I think that's important too. I've already alluded to confidentiality issues in older adults who are caring for or supporting younger adults. I think ageism runs through a lot of the things that we've talked about so far. So in terms of working with older adults, I think there's the thing about dementia, there's the thing about carer stress. There are, if our study is anything to go by, there are only a small number of cases that would fit the descriptor domestic abuse grown old. But I think we do need to think about the dynamic of caregiving. We need to think about how we risk assess older adults and whether we're assessing the risks that are involved in these sort of domestic violence situations. We need to think about the complication of capacity, because sometimes what happens is that people are found not to have capacity, or they're thought not to have capacity to make decisions. We need to think about what's the role of safeguarding, and again, running through it all, I think, is the question of attitudes towards older people and the influence that ageism has in our assessments and in many agencies' work with older people. I don't know whether we've any time left, Kathleen. You can advise me.
We have got 1 minute, probably not enough to deal with all the questions that are flooding in, but there's quite a lot of comments about mercy killings, about different practices in different countries, about whether social services are really equipped to deal with all of this. And I think people are taking away a real strong message about assessing this in relation to mental health, dementia and mental capacity. So that's really good that people are taking that away and really reconsidering how we make those assessments and interventions. And there's lots of comments coming in, Susan, to say thank you very much, which is what I was just going to finish with. Thank you for such an interesting and thought-provoking presentation is one comment from Maria, and many people saying that they found it very inspiring. Participants today from all over the country and the world. So thank you so much, Susan. It's been absolutely fascinating, and you really had to rush through a very complex subject.